Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Thank you very much for your patience. This is going to be a long intro, so stick with me. 3 main points. Number one, I was locked out with COVID for the past week, so I've been recovering from that. That's why there hasn't been any videos over the past 7 days, but I'm all fine now, thankfully, and so we can get back to it. Right now, we're in the middle of a country series on Russia. If you haven't seen the other videos before, go check it out. I'll leave the playlist in the top left or top right here, whatever it is, I don't know. And we'll be focusing on the Great Northern War for the next 2 videos. This is going to be 2 parts. Overall, it's 5 parts from extra credits, but I'm just going to splice parts 1 and 2 and then 3 through 5 together. After that, I've read your comments. I will be doing a video on the Decemberist revolutions from Epic History TV. I saw lots of comments on that one. Don't worry, I'll be doing that. Then I'll be doing the Russian Revolution oversimplified, and we will end it with geography now. After that, I will be holding a poll on YouTube where we will pick from 5 countries what the next country series is going to be on. The 5 countries are Germany, Austria, Poland, United States, and France. And those are just what I have right now off the top of my head. I might change it. We'll see. Also, if you notice here in the bottom, hey, that's my community post that I was reading these videos off of. If you see in the bottom here, I've decided to open up a Patreon. I will do another video on why I decided to do that. Basically, to make it very quick, I get tons and tons and tons of requests. One person, you know who you are if you're watching this, requested me to react to the history of the education system in Ohio, which sounds like an interesting topic, but again, I'm not sure if it's good to really put out on this YouTube channel because I want to try and keep, sort of a broader focus and really always keep my audience, you guys, in mind. So this Patreon will be for exclusive videos. I've priced the tiers as low as I think is reasonable, right? 3, 5, and 10, and then you'll be able to vote for polls. You'll be able to request certain videos, and then I will be doing exclusive reaction videos there once a week, probably more than once a week. We'll see if there's interest in it. So without further ado, I hope I got through all those points as quickly as possible. Let's get into the Great Northern War when Sweden ruled the world. And also, this is more of a Sweden-focused video, but it also has Russia to do with it. So, long intro. If you haven't already yet, please remember to like, comment, subscribe. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
1697. Sweden is one of the truly great powers of Europe, with an unstoppable army and an empire that nearly encircles the Baltic. But as the church bells toll, the world knows the king is dead and his 14-year-old son is inheritor to the crown. The vultures begin to circle.
What were you doing at 14? I can only imagine being 14 years old and then having to, this is Charles VII, right? Charles VIII. And then having to overtake an entire country. Wow.
The danger of empire is that the more you have that other people want, and the Swedish Empire was no exception. In this case, the lands of the Swedish Empire had drawn the attention of someone brilliant, dynamic, ruthless, and ambitious. The 25-year-old Peter the Great. Peter had a love of the West. He was drawn to all things European. He saw the future of Russia not to the south or the east, but chasing the setting sun. He saw that future in becoming part of the great European economic system. But there was one obstacle to this grand design. He needed a port in the Baltic. He needed a way his ships could sail west bearing Russian goods or projecting the might of Russian arms. But the Baltic ports that Russia had once held had all been gobbled up by the Swedish Empire. Now it was time to take them back. But Peter wasn't alone. The king of the Danes had long chafed under the idea that traditionally Danish land in southern Sweden had been taken from them by the Swedish Empire, and he longed to get it back. And Augustus, the king of Poland-Lithuania, found an intriguing prospect within the Swedish borders as well. You see, the Polish-Lithuanian king was an elected title without much power, but he wanted to become a hereditary monarch, ruling over Poland-Lithuania as many of the other monarchs of Europe ruled over their domain. Right on his border, just inside the Swedish territory, was the small province of Livonia. The nobles there offered to declare him their hereditary king if he would liberate them from the Swedish. This intrigued him. If he could get them to declare him king and then integrate them with Poland-Lithuania, it would go a long way toward achieving his larger goal of making a real kingship out of the Polish-Lithuanian crown. Soon, these 3 forces became secret allies against the Swedish. Things dragged on for a while as Peter continued to pretend to be a friend of Sweden, hoping to avoid a war with them until his current war with the Ottomans could be wrapped up.
Yeah, and so what's so fascinating is that modernly we sort of think of Denmark and Sweden as these very egalitarian places, but at the time they were really forces to be reckoned with, right? The Kingdom of Denmark that they also had incorporated Norway that wasn't free until I forget the date, but either 1890s or 1910s. I don't remember exactly. It was before the First World War, though. And just crazy to think that how much has really changed for Scandinavia overall. That was once really feared kingdoms, but now is, sort of the place of egalitarianism.
But at last, in 1700, his allies moved ahead, striking at the Swedes without warning, though in a piecemeal and ill-coordinated fashion. 14,000 Polish-Lithuanian troops marched across the border of Livonia first and laid siege to the capital. But the Swedes counterattacked. The Polish-Lithuanian troops were shattered. Their general lay dead. Soon, they were in full retreat back to the border. Then the Danes made their move, a move to which Charles XII, the boy king of Sweden, responded with unexpected vigor. With the energy of youth, Charles raised money from every quarter, bolstering the finances of the overextended Swedish Empire and launching a force that he himself would lead. Daring naval...
Okay, so imagine a 14-year-old, so someone who's in grade 9 or grade 10, leading the armies of a nation against another world power. That's amazing. I mean, I understand why the other powers here would strike when they would. I mean, you have a boy king, which usually is sort of a mark of instability at the time, because it makes sense, right? I mean, if you would assume that, the kid's only 14 years old, and yes, he has a regent, and yes, he has a council, most likely, but, you would think that this would be the perfect time to strike. However, it's pretty rare that you get a once-in-a-lifetime military genius who at this time is a 14-year-old boy, and you decide to go up against him, and while, eventually Sweden would win, at this point, doesn't look so good.
Maneuvers and a surprise landing, the stunned Danish forces capitulated and left the alliance against the Swedes entirely. Meanwhile, Peter still stood by. It was the perfect time to press the Swedes, and he knew it, but still no word of peace had come from the Ottomans. At last, when the peace was signed with the Ottomans in the hottest days of summer, it was finally Peter's turn to act, and act he did. To support the now reeling Polish-Lithuanian forces, he raised a massive army and marched toward Livonia. His objective was Narva, a major town right on the Russian border. But in this age, with the mud and roads of Russia, an army of that size moved pretty slowly. It was November before they reached Narva. In the biting cold, they dug trenches into the frozen ground and prepared for a siege. But their guns did little, and their assaults were swept aside. So a real siege it became, to starve the town out. But once Charles XII had thrashed the Danes, he had wasted no time packing up his little army and moving it east to deal with the invasion of Livonia. Braving autumn storms on the Baltic, he personally led his forces toward the true test of their strength. Many of his counselors argued against this endeavor. After all, even if he got to Livonia, he'd have to march his troops 150 miles across wasted ground in the middle of winter. And if he actually reached Narva, he would be outnumbered at least 4-1. More than that, the Russians he planned to assault were dug in with siege works, defenses they'd been preparing for weeks. But the now 18-year-old Charles was not put off. He was spoiling for a fight. So with the same boundless energy he applied to everything, he launched his winter campaign.
I'm curious, actually. So during this time in the 1700s, how would you break defensive sieges? So as I said, the Russians have dug in over these past couple months. How exactly do you break that? I mean, I know in World War I, obviously this was the big issue where you would have basically stalemates, you'd go into no man's land, trench warfare, etc. But how was this done during the 1700s? Is it the same principles? Let's find out. But maybe if you know more about that, let me know in the comment section below.
And thus it was that on the 30th of November, the young king assembled his 10,000 men against at least 40,000 Russians. They calmly began to prepare for an assault. The Russians watched this in disbelief. Peter, who was used to a much slower pace of warfare, thought that it was impossible that anyone could attack immediately after completing a march like Charles just had. So he had left the night before to attend business in Russia, leaving in command a subordinate who, in line with Peter's policy of bringing in foreign experts, was a foreigner who barely spoke Russian. The rain began to pour, and yet the Swedish army calmly continued to ready for an assault. The sky darkened. A storm rolled in, the snow was pouring in sheets, sleet slashing at the troops. The blizzard blinded both sides. Fighting was impossible. Men stood shivering in regimental formation, weapons at the ready for a battle that wasn't gonna come. Charles's advisors suggested that he call off the assault. But then the roaring wind began to turn, and Charles's keen eyes saw it. During this brief window, the enemy would be entirely blinded by the snow. He ordered the advance. 2 columns hidden by a sea of white fell upon the Russian lines, which quickly began to break, shots flying high in the snow. Soon it was down to bayonet and saber in the Russian trenches. Most of the Russian troops were ill-trained levies and began to scatter before the Swedish veterans. The Swedes had pierced the enemy line, and the Russian troops began to melt away. Soon it was a complete rout. Panicked Russian soldiers chased by ragged and wraith-like Swedes, appearing like ghosts from out of the snow. The men stampeded over one of the only bridges across the Narva River. Under the weight of so many panicked souls, it collapsed. Timber and stone and Russian bodies tumbling into the water below. Thousands of Russians were trapped. It was an impossible victory, a crushing blow. But now Charles had another objective. The King of Poland-Lithuania had yet to personally suffer at his hand, and Charles was not a man to let what he considered to be a perfidious treachery go unpunished. So, though Peter greatly feared a Swedish advance into Russia, and began immediately patching together a second force for defense of the motherland, Charles did not pursue Peter's deeply wounded army. Instead, he wintered in Livonia, and prepared to bring the fight to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth the following year. Meanwhile, the rest of Europe...
Because I wonder that too, because during this time, I mean, obviously you have Napoleon's infamous march on Moscow. As we learned in the Epic History TV video, Moscow burned 4 times in its history. There might have been one they left out there, so maybe it's more. But I wonder sort of what would the objective here be. But it's interesting that it's more of a defensive objective, right? And rather to push for Poland, Lithuania than to actually push right into Russia, especially with a weakened Russian army. But I wonder too, so those troops that were fighting in the Ottomans then, that were fighting the Ottomans, would they have been drawn up as well to fight against now the Swedish, or how exactly would that work? I'm kind of curious about that. I don't know, maybe you guys can let me know below.
Tumbled into the chaos of the War of the Spanish Succession. So preoccupied they were with the events in the West that they were no longer engaged enough in the events of the East to serve as arbiters or brokers for peace. In fact, diplomats and ministers wrote to Charles to tell him that he had a singular opportunity. He could tip the scales of Europe. If he would make a victorious peace with the powers he had just crushed, he could determine the outcome of the Spanish War and decide who would inherit the vast lands of the Spanish crown. Play it right, and he could ensure another 100 years of preeminence for the Swedish people. But he never responded to any of these letters. He had his sights set on only one thing: war. So join us next time as we explore the character of the 2 great antagonists of this conflict, Peter and Charles, and cover the invasion of Poland-Lithuania, the second phase of the Great Northern War.
Fascinating, and maybe that's sort of a what if alternative history video in and of itself, of what if Sweden had to pursue that. Unfortunately, I don't know enough about the topic. As I've said multiple times before, this is not really my forte in history. But who knows? Maybe if they had pursued it, what would have happened? You guys can let me know. Let's get into part 2 of when Sweden ruled the world, the Great Northern War. Part 2, let's get into it.
With the Russians and the Danes effectively out of the war, Charles planned to descend with the full force of his victorious army upon the one enemy that remained to him, Augustus, King of Poland-Lithuania.
Yeah. Yeah, and Augustus is an interesting character in history. He's otherwise known as Augustus the Strong. He's known as Augustus the Strong because he was famous for being able to break horseshoes with his own bare hands, which Yeah, is either you either have a poor blacksmith or a really strong man, one of the two. But he was also interesting in the fact that he was not supposed to be the king of Poland, but rather his brother. And when his brother died, I think it was from disease. I don't remember exactly. He then assumed the crown of the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And as you will see, it doesn't go too well. It does not go too well, as you'll find out in this video.
Now, you would think that the situation would be looking pretty grim for Poland-Lithuania. They've just finished getting kicked around, they're basically out of money and resources, they're politically fractured, and their allies have essentially all dropped out of the war.
Yep.
Most people would back out now, find a diplomatic solution, see if they could cut their losses. But Augustus had a new plan. Just keep losing. He made a few half-hearted attempts at peace, figuring that if he didn't really put a lot of effort into it, he could get right on to losing some more. So when Charles XII basically ignored his call for peace, Augustus gathered his generals and said to them, "Guys, we really absolutely cannot let the Swedes cross the Dwina River, or hoo boy, are we gonna lose a lot. Wink wink nudge nudge."
Spoiler
and
alert.
with that, his commanders set out to meet what supporting troops the Russians could give them, which surprisingly was actually more men than they were fielding themselves. Proceeding with the plan, the main Polish-Lithuanian commander managed to deceive himself into thinking that the Swedes were going to land miles from where they were, and went personally with the best of his troops to defend a place where really nobody was going, all while leaving two non-military men basically in charge of the real army. Unaware of this, and so undaunted by Augustus's fearsome plan, Charles...
This is the one thing that, like, obviously I enjoy doing these videos, it's kind of my thing, but the problem is like sometimes just it's those little details there. It's like, okay, well, why did he think that it was going to be a different landing there? And like, for example that I can give in World War II is that obviously infamously the Nazi high command, there was arguments between, but generally they did not believe that they were going to land in Normandy, right? And there was all sorts of reasons for it. They thought it would go through the shortest point in the channel, and the British had intelligence. They set up fake tanks. They set up they dropped leaflets and everything, etc., 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 right? So there was reasons why for it. But I wish that, and I understand this is only a 9-minute long video, and this is a big topic. It's 21 years of war, but I wish it was those little details. But maybe you guys can let me know below.
The 12th landed where everybody knew he was going to land all along, except for this master of self-deception. Yet still, despite all of this, the odds for the Polish-Lithuanian forces seemed pretty good. They outnumbered Charles 3-1, and they were dug in, while Charles would have to manage an amphibious landing and assault their entrenched positions. As dawn just barely broke through the darkness, the Swedes filled boats with damp straw and set them alight, sending them sailing towards the shore, great plumes of smoke obscuring their approach. The Polish-Lithuanian cannonades fired, and the clever floating counter-batteries of the Swedes sang. Under this bombardment, the troops approached, and in the first vessel against all entireties sat the Swedish king Charles XII. He landed with his grenadiers. The Polish-Lithuanian troops fell upon him, planning to push him back into the waves, but they faced the best of the Swedish regiments, led personally by their king. The Swedes did not falter. The Polish-Lithuanian troops fell back, and the Russians fled in a screaming panic, many having never fired a shot. At last, though, the Polish-Lithuanian commander returned with all the troops he had taken with him, and the Polish-Lithuanian forces assailed the Swedes again. But Swedish reinforcements had now landed, and they were now much greater in number. Again, the Poles and the Lithuanians were beaten back, and then a third time, at which point the Polish-Lithuanians were basically like, you know what, screw this, let's go home. Which was a pretty good thing for Charles, because having come from ravaged Livonia, he basically started this whole campaign with no supplies whatsoever. He did manage to capture plenty after the battle, though, and was now well on his way to being ready for a good long fight.
I would love to see that visualized. If there is, I'll look it up after this, but if there is some sort of movie or TV series, or even like just a reenactment on YouTube, I don't care, whatever, of what that would look like, that would be just astounding to see, with the smoke screens and firing the cannons and then the amphibious assault afterwards. I mean, wow, that's really something. That's really, really cool. I mean, we can't forget the amount of people that died in this conflict, but nonetheless.
Augustus, realizing now that the Swedes were clearly not caving before his plan to just keep losing, went back to the drawing board. Now he had an even better plan. Now he would just keep losing even more.
Warsaw.
And so, while Charles wintered in Wergen, throwing snowballs at his officers and breaking their windows so that they didn't fall too much in love with comfort, Augustus prepared for his next near miss.
Is that true?
This time, he was to get himself trounced in a swamp. It was a near-run thing for a while. For a moment, it looked like the Polish-Lithuanian forces might accidentally prevail. Augustus was in a good position, surrounded by woods and boggy terrain. He outnumbered the Swedish forces 2-1, and there was just no way the Swedes were going to drag their cannon through that morass. It was touch and go for a bit, hard fighting for the Swedish forces, who were, as usual, exhausted from Charles's relentless marches. So then Augustus, nice fellow that he was, managed to let the Swedes take over his camp and turn his own artillery on his troops while they tried to retreat through a marsh.
What?
Yet still, Charles was not cowed by Augustus's mighty strategy of just keep losing forever. And so Augustus refined his plans even further. He realized now that this approach had been too complex thus far, too multifaceted. He would now simplify it, put it in layman's terms. His new plan was losing. Keep doing it. So Charles rode up to the gates of...
I'm sorry, but again, one of these things, I know it's a 9-minute video and maybe this is a whole other thing, but how? I really want to know how that's possible that the Swedish troops were then able to turn artillery on themselves. I mean... Yeah, I pretty much have nothing more to say than that. I'd really like to know more on that. Maybe you guys can let me know below, but still, that's shocking and fascinating at the same time.
Krakow and shouted, "Open the door!" And when the guards peeked out to see who this shouting man was, Charles personally forced the gate and held it, while 300 of his men, who, not quite prepared for this, charged through anyway. And so it was that Charles took the great Polish city of Krakow with a handful of men armed only with unloaded muskets and canes.
No.
You've got to hand it to Augustus. That was some solid losing. But even this did not make Charles quit in disgust.
Details
and so, after being deposed by Charles XII, who elevated another king in his place, Augustus spent some time thinking. Pondering for a while and furrowing his brow, he at last came to one resplendent, crystal-clear idea. He had thought the one sentence that he needed to think, and that sentence was, "Cool. Now seems like a good time for a civil war." So Augustus raised his banner against the new king. But the civil war began slowly. Augustus assembled his forces in the Duchy of Saxony, while the Russians ravaged Sweden's Baltic provinces, which really had little to do with Poland-Lithuania, but, you know, good times. Meanwhile, Charles laid siege to the ancient fortress of Thorn, where he won surprising praise from the Polish people, as when the city fell, he treated it with remarkable gentleness, letting captured men return to their families, even driving a herd of cattle and a flock of sheep into the city so that the starving defenders could eat. But once things got going, the whole war teetered back and forth, with Augustus recapturing Warsaw while Charles was out trying to compel parts of Poland-Lithuania to support his puppet king, and then Charles swooping back in to retake the capital while Augustus beat a retreat. But by 1705, the dominoes began to fall. The great Poland-Lithuanian plan was to crush the Swedes between the hammer of Augustus's forces marching from the west and the great Russian anvil to the east. But Augustus's forces ran into a tiny Swedish contingent outside of Warsaw, 1,900 cavalry and just 60 infantry. The Polish-Lithuanian commander, with his 10,000 men, was certain of victory. His forces rushed against this small band of Swedes, but somehow, by sheer grit, the Swedish cavalry, despite being outflanked or almost encircled by the overwhelming number of the enemy, threw back their attackers. And then, at the last minute, the 60 infantrymen emerged from the tall rye grass where they'd been hiding, the surprise turning the Polish-Lithuanian effort to regroup into a rout. Predictably, That's gotta be a Sabaton song, right? Like, come on, that must be a Sabaton song in and of itself. Wow, again, details, but that's amazing. The fact that he's been outnumbered in every single battle so far during this war, right? I'm sure there's probably more in between these 5 years, but he's been outnumbered every single time, and he's outsmarted and outwitted his opponents. I'm actually quite curious why Charles XII, I said Charles VIII in the first part accidentally, sorry, why Charles XII is not as remembered as someone like Napoleon, for example.
But I mean, hey, I guess we'll find out.
Similar happened to the Russians in the east, and soon the iron was beating up both the hammer and the anvil. And for the sake of brevity, this just keeps happening all over, both in open battle and in sieges. The Polish-Lithuanian forces and the Russian forces just keep getting crushed. But Augustus made one more push for Warsaw. Here again, he was intercepted by a force half his size, but this time superior in cavalry. His commander tried to hide which of his troops were Russian by having them turn their uniforms inside out, but even this clever ruse did no good. The Swedish commander realized which part of the line was made up of Russian conscripts and assaulted it with all of his force, swinging his cavalry in from the rear and the side. Meanwhile, the rest of the army was rendered useless by assaults on both flanks, the Swedish commander copying a page from Hannibal's book and managing to envelop the enemy forces with his smaller army, much as Hannibal did at Kenny. Soon, the army was in full retreat. But with their superior cavalry, the Swedes were able to cut them off, and the retreat became an unconditional surrender. No longer able to field an army, Augustus was forced to sign a humiliating peace, giving up his kingship, abandoning his alliance with Russia, and acknowledging Charles's puppet king of Poland-Lithuania. But Augustus is not done yet. Eventually, he would stumble upon a novel, new, and arguably better idea: winning. So join us next time as the two greatest figures of this period, Charles XII and Peter the Great, square off in a battle for the destiny of Eastern Europe.
Fascinating. I'm very curious too if there are any Swedes watching this video. I have a car. What is sort of Charles XII's reputation in modern day Sweden? I heard lots of comments from Peter the Great's modern reputation, and that it's really quite high, really quite highly spoken of in Russian schools, public systems, and then as well as in the sort of the Russian, what would you say, understanding of history overall, Catherine the Great as well. And so I'm curious, what is Charles XII's position in Sweden's history? Is he sort of looked upon as maybe, you know, I know that this was sort of the end of authoritarian monarchy in Sweden. After this, it was more the parliament took more power, etc. But hey, I'm curious because so far, it seems like he's an absolute genius. So yeah, great video so far. I will be back tomorrow with parts 3 through 5 for extra history. And then after that, we will be talking about the Decembrists' revolution. And it looks like this is going to be more focused on Russia, parts 3 through 5. So thank you all very much for joining me. And I will see you guys tomorrow in the next video. Take care.